So the US war gets going, and again, I won't dwell too much on the chronology. My understanding is that Amy Greenberg did kind of cover this to a certain extent. But in essence, we are thinking in terms of three. We can summarize, or we can kind of look at it briefly in terms of three major campaigns. There's the Northern Campaign, the Eastern Campaign, and the Campaign of the Valley of Mexico. And the Northern Campaign basically sees Santa Anna and his army of about 20,000, 22,000 men that he puts together in San Luis Potosí, going up and confronting Taylor kind of in the battles of Buenavista in Mexico is known as the Battle of Angostura, following kind of the move, the progression of Taylor as he moves kind of after the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca del Alma, taking kind of Monterrey and other parts of the north. And this is a battle which, again, if you look at the sources, some of the Mexican sources will argue that it is a kind of victory of Santa Anna, but of course it isn't. It's not as if Taylor necessarily wins either, but there is a moment in this battle where if Santa Anna's troops had not run out of food and had not run out of kind of ammunition and could keep going, in theory, kind of Taylor's days were numbered at the end of this battle, except that Santa Anna does run out kind of food after 2 grueling kind of days of combat and decides to retreat. So he achieves nothing. And in fact, of the 20,000 men that go up to kind of confront Taylor in Buenavista, only 5,000 make it back to San Luis Potosí. And this is kind of, except that rather than the US campaign progressing from the north down to San Luis Potosí, which is what Santa Anna has supposedly kind of suggested Polk should do, which would kind of be really problematic for the US Army to make that journey down. Instead, of course, we've got Winfield Scott arriving kind of in Veracruz, and the campaign taking a different perspective, as it is the Eastern Campaign. Now, Santa Anna returns to Mexico City, except that before he does that, between February and March, so whilst Santa Anna is confronting Taylor in the Northern Campaign, the moderates in Mexico City link up with members of the church who fund a revolt where there are also Mexican conservatives involved, kind of to bring down the Gómez Farías kind of presidency and administration in Mexico City, and to put a stop to the law of the 11th of January 1847, whereby kind of Gómez Farías, with the approval of Santa Anna, kind of had decreed that the church would fund the war effort to the tune of 20-odd kind of million pesos, which kind of the church kind of funds a rebellion to stop this from happening. So Santa Anna returns to a Mexico City that is undergoing a civil war in Mexico City, with the streets kind of fighting, Mexicans fighting each other kind of over, kind of between the moderates and radicals, rather than again putting their effort together to kind of confront the foreign aggressor. And in this context, Santa Anna kind of takes a pragmatic decision, removes Gómez Farías, places a moderate in charge, but rather than stay and govern and be a president, he makes his way to Veracruz to confront kind of Scott. And actually confronts Scott in Cerro Gordo, which is part of one of his haciendas, the Hacienda of El Encero. So he's fighting on home ground. And from Santa Anna's perspective, the main thing is to keep Taylor in the yellow fever infested kind of part of Veracruz and not allow them to climb high up enough in the mountain where there is no yellow fever. So he tries to keep them down beneath the Cerro Gordo. And the Cerro Gordo area, you've got 2 mountains. There's a kind of Cerro Gordo, which is a big kind of mountain, and the Cerro Chico, which is next to it. Santa Anna commits the disastrous mistake of not protecting the Cerro Chico. Taylor sees this, troops arise, bring cannons onto the Cerro Chico and attack from the side. They flank Santa Anna's troops, and Cerro Gordo is a complete disaster, which victory for the US as they progress further, make their way to Puebla, whilst Santa Anna kind of makes his way back to Mexico City, where interestingly, he is prepared to kind of hand over his resignation since he is of these defeats and let somebody else take over. The generals say, no, 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 we need you to kind of defend Mexico. And so he therefore sets about orchestrating the defense of the Valley of Mexico with a number of crucial, brutal battles taking place, including, of course, the Battle of Chapultepec, where supposedly those 6 cadets that I mentioned at the beginning died. And Mexico City falls eventually on the 15th of September after Santana leaves Mexico City, joins up with Juan Alvarez, and tries to kind of move to Oaxaca to get a resistance going, but fails. And whilst the government of Mexico City leaves Mexico, a bit like the Russians did against Napoleon, leaves Mexico City and heads out to Querétaro, kind of whilst Mexico City falls to the American troops. And it becomes evident for the government in Querétaro that their days are numbered, the war is lost, and negotiations begin between Nicholas Trist and those representatives, comisionados, that are sent by kind of the government in Querétaro. And what you have, and I put there as reading, I mean, it's maybe a bit dry to read the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, but I put it there as a text for you to read, simply because it gives you some sense of what kind of was agreed at the end of that. And I guess what is worth kind of focusing on in particular are Articles 5, 8, 9, and 12. And I won't say too much about them, simply because my understanding is that Elizabeth will be talking about them. But what you have is they're problematic in the sense that, one, they recognize there is this kind of granting of the half of Mexico to the United States. There are issues there in terms of what will happen to all of the people that are Mexican, that consider themselves Mexican, that live in California, that live in New Mexico, that live in kind of, how will they fit? And there are a series of stipulations as to, they have a year in which to decide whether they're Mexican or members of the US. But it does pose a problem for all of those kind of people that live there. There is an issue in terms of one of the articles there that one of the agreements was that the US would be responsible for, in a way, policing, I guess, the First Nations in terms of the movements of the indigenous communities, in particular the Comanche, and their raids, and that they were meant to control that, but inevitably that didn't happen. And there is also within that the granting of $15 million kind of dollars to the Mexico, which is an interesting kind of inclusion there, because they're not buying anything. They've won the war. I guess it's supposedly there to kind of make it easier for the Mexican government to kind of approve this treaty, which they do. But in the end, this money kind of is spent up already on debts that the Mexican government has, and it achieves little. The real consequence clearly is that Mexico loses half of its country to the United States in what many Mexicans see as a humiliating disaster. Now, interestingly, Santa Anna does not sign the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. After having tried to keep the fight going, he finds himself going into exile and is disgusted. He is disgusted with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. There are rebellions as well, kind of by a number of kind of Mexican army officers, including, interestingly, Tomas Mejia, who will become famous later in his life for supporting the intervention with Emperor Maximilian on the throne, but at this point against the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And it results in a crisis of identity. I mean, and I think that this is why Josefina Vázquez argues, I guess, that it is now that Mexicans start to think about, what is it? What is it to be Mexican? Now they are forced to think, now that they've been faced with this other, in terms of as represented by the US, that they've seen this other move into Mexico, and that they have fought against him. It makes them kind of consider what it is to be Mexican. And what we have is a series of members of that generation of independence who have now become, they're old men who remember what Mexico was like kind of towards the end of the colonial period, who see this disaster and start writing histories of Mexico, in some cases, to retain a memory of what we were, under the fear that we will lose everything that we are, faced with with the inevitability of the entire annexation of the country further down the line, to others that have this need to try and understand what it is to be Mexican, to see why, to explain why they lost this war. And you see, for example, some minutes of a meeting of army officers after the Battle of Cerro Gordo, where it appears in these minutes of their meeting that they can't understand why Mexicans aren't just spontaneously rising up in arms to fight the Americans as they progress into Mexico. And there is a sense that there is no national spirit because maybe there is no sense of nationhood. Mexicans don't see themselves as Mexican in the way that the military do, because they fight for Mexico, because they have traveled across Mexico and they have a sense of what Mexico is. And which explains in turn why under Santa Anna between 1853 and 55, that is when there will be an attempt under his dictatorship there is a commissioning of a national anthem. The national anthem the Mexicans sing is commissioned then. There's an attempt to create a sense of nationhood through creating Mexican kind of traditions. And that is one of the key early consequences of the war. And in this kind of soul-searching kind of attempt to understand what Mexico is and what it is to be Mexican, you have this emergence of very clearly a dichotomy between those who see Mexico as a Catholic nation, kind of that is profoundly Catholic and that needs to kind of in a way go back to the way it was, to its origins, to a powerful church kind of that sees society kind of under threat by kind of these foreign kind of Protestant kind of influences, against those who have always admired the United States, that are finding it now problematic to defend the United States in the context of this war, but that still see that as the role model. And clearly this will in the end become kind of the background to the bloodshed of the horrific civil war of the Reforma, which has been my kind of obsession in the last 5-6 years. Interestingly, of course, the war has the same impact in the United States. I mean, in the end, the U.S. Civil War kind of is a consequence of the Mexican kind of U.S. war in the sense of slavery. Kind of what do we do about all these states that have now been taken from Mexico? Are we going to allow slavery to move into them or not? And that, again, it will intoxicate the context in the U.S. as it does in the Mexican context. And I guess the key issues, kind of, if we look at it, is one, obviously from a Mexican perspective, this is an unjust war. And you know, the course has this question, you know, is it a war or is it an intervention? It's an intervention. Of course it's an intervention. It's a foreign invasion of a sovereign nation, right? So of course it's an unjust war. Although clearly, and you know, to nuance what I'm saying, and Marcela Terraza is another great historian of Mexican-U.S. relations. I mean, she would be somebody who would make the case that, but you know, Mexicans did not populate these parts of what became part of the United States. So, I mean, Mexico was fighting a war which in a way did not make sense. They made more sense to kind of sell all of that, kind of give it away. No, there were not enough Mexicans who wanted this, but obviously that was not going to happen. But an unjust war in that sense, and also an unequal war. I mean, that's in terms of the United States has a population of 20 million in 1846, up against a nation of 6 million, maybe 8 million. A country that has been independent for longer, in the case of the United States, that has succeeded in establishing a greater degree of constitutional stability. I guess Peter Guardino is going to nuance that tomorrow, but certainly kind of from a Mexican perspective, you know, the US seems to be doing all right. They have industrialization in a way that, at least the north of the United States, is being industrialized in ways that Mexico hasn't. I mean, Tornel, who I quoted at the beginning of the talk, Tornel spends time as a Mexican minister plenipotentiary in Baltimore in 1831 and is amazed by, you know, the factories, the thriving economy that you have in the United States. This is not the case in Mexico. Of course, he will take pride in the fact that he sees slaves where there are no slaves in Mexico. But certainly, and in terms of weapons, something as simple as weapons, the weapons that the American army is using are far more accurate, have a far further range, and are far better weapons. There has always been this perspective that the Mexicans were also profoundly divided. They're fighting each other, as I've already mentioned, the revolt of the Polcos as an example, rather than putting a united front, while supposedly those troops kind of invading Mexico are carrying Prescott in their hands, the history of the conquest of Mexico, and are united in their vision of manifest destiny. Again, I think Peter Guardino may nuance that and sees there are greater divisions in the US troops than has tended to be said from a Mexico perspective, but it is there as well. And a country that has had all of these problems that, as I've tried to kind of, in a way, encapsulate in these 50 minutes. And there is this kind of the tragic take of somebody like Carlos María de Bustamante, who had fought in the War of Independence, kind of who, on the 15th of September, 1847, kind of looks out and sees the spangled banner, kind of the US flag flying from the National Palace in Mexico City, and says, on the anniversary of us beginning our War of Independence on the 16th of September, kind of 1810, kind of, is this God's punishment? He granted us freedom and we wasted it, and so we deserve it. And certainly there will be kind of a profound introspective look at where they went wrong to begin with. But eventually, interestingly, once the Reforma period comes to an end, once Benito Juarez triumphs over kind of the French intervention and over the figure of Santa Anna, there is an attempt to kind of look back and try and rescue pride in what has happened. And what they do is they will turn Santa Anna into the perfect scapegoat, so that the war against the United States will become kind of all about Santa Anna's betrayal. His transactions with Polk will be proof of the fact that he lost the war for a fistful of dollars on purpose. And so that, in a way, that ends any kind of need to think longer or deeper about why Mexico lost the war to the United States. And instead, we will have the celebration of the Niños Héroes, these 6 cadets that, as we see in the painting by Siqueiros on the PowerPoint, which is in the Chapultepec ceiling of Chapultepec Palace, plummeted to their deaths rather than hand over the flag, except that, as we know from recent research, or not that recent anyway, these Niños Héroes, yes, they existed in as much as they were cadets who fought and died, but the whole story of the leaping out of the tower and not to kind of hand over the flag, all of that is not true. I mean, that was just invented in 1868, interestingly, at the end of the intervention, as a way of trying to kind of rescue the past. I end with an anecdote, and then we'll open up for questions and answers, and that is that back in the 90s, when it was we were about to celebrate 150 years since 1847, there was a group of US historians that tried to kind of put together a whole massive team of researchers to produce the Encyclopedia of the Mexican War. And interestingly, there was a whole series of Mexican historians who refused to contribute to the Encyclopedia of the Mexican War because they were calling it the Encyclopedia of the Mexican War. And they would say, well, which Mexican War? Okay, this is a kind of typical kind of US perspective, kind of call it, the Mexican-U.S. war, not, so we're not going to play ball with you guys. And instead, in Mexico, they were celebrating 150 years since the Niños Héroes, which never existed. So interesting. I mean, we can obviously discuss in terms of how you approach this topic in class, or how do we deal with commemoration and memory, kind of this conflict on both sides of the border. Certainly it remains problematic and conflictive. But I will end there, and let's open it up. I end there. Just one slide for you to look at. This is what Mexico looked like in 1824. And this is what Mexicans were fighting to retain in 1846.